close, you've had an opportunity to share with each other how you have read and heard the Joseph story. And I hope in doing so, as others told you the story, that you saw what was important through their eyes, and then you were able to share with the others at your table what was important in the story through your eyes. And I hope that that gave you new perspectives on the Joseph story. What I want to say about the Joseph story, and I hope that the poem refreshed it for you. The Joseph story is a great story. It's a story of dreams, a story of family dysfunction, no surprise, we're in Genesis. It's a story of impossible odds and improbable success. It's a story of reconciliation and forgiveness. There's action, there's suspense. It's enjoyable and it's emotional. It's also an important turning point in the larger narrative. There are two things that I think we should notice with this story and how it drives the narrative. First, this story is intended to set up the Exodus story, which we'll see in our next book and our next Bible study. Once again, we find Genesis pointing into the future. We've seen that a lot. God making promises about the future. We see the journey that slowly led them to Egypt, and now this Joseph story finds them in Egypt, the place of the Exodus. The story also, it does a good job explaining how the descendants of Israel came into Egypt. It does that very well, so it's an important story in that sense. It gives you, once again, an origin story. They were in Egypt. How'd they get there? Well, this is how. So that's an important part of the text. It's an important turning point. It's going to serve as a bridge as we get ready for our study of Exodus. There's another way that this story is a turning point, and I think it's a little more subtle. In this story, God begins to step back. In the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning of creation, God created Adam, in the second creation story, with God's own hands. It was incredibly close, incredibly intimate. That's how the story starts. It's not a God who's off in heaven. It's a God who's so close that God is touching the person, breathing life into his face. Incredibly intimate. And then we move to someone like Abraham, and it's not that intimate, not as intimate as it was in the garden, but still is an intimate relationship, a friendship. And so we see in that story that God and Abraham are friends. There's enough trust in the relationship that Abraham can negotiate with God. Remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham says, well, don't destroy it if there's this many. Well, if there's this many, surely you would spare them. If there's this many, surely you would spare them. And it keeps negotiating back and forth. There's a trust there. Abraham feels empowered to do that. He feels comfortable enough to have that conversation with God. God is comfortable enough with Abraham that God says, all right, if there's that many, yeah, I'll spare it. There's a kind of intimacy. We get the same piece with God making promises to Abraham, God and Abraham making covenants together. You get this sense that there's basically this like face-to-face kind of friendship relationship between God and Abraham. And then we know from the Isaac story and the Jacob story that, again, God speaks directly to Isaac, directly to Jacob, makes promises. They have these divine encounters. And so these forefathers before have had these encounters in a place with God, and they build an altar and they say, this is the place where God appeared to me. There's this intimate closeness that God is very active. In the narrative, God is in a starring role. We're never far from hearing God's voice. But not Joseph. Now, Joseph had dreams, and the text interprets that as a way in which he understood what God was up to. He's given interpretation of dreams, and the text tells us that, God was with him. But God never appears to Joseph. In the same promise that's been the promise all through Genesis, that I'll make you a great nation and you'll have children and you'll see your children and your children's children, the same promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God doesn't make to Joseph. Jacob tells Joseph, here's the promise that our God has given our family. So Jacob is the one who is speaking the words of God to Joseph. It doesn't come from God directly like it does for the previous ancestors. Unlike his ancestors, Joseph builds no altars. He establishes no sanctuaries. The people of Egypt do not turn to his God. He worships Yahweh in a land of foreign gods. It's a different story. God has become a present character, but a background character. In the sense that we get, and this is going to continue to mostly be the case. I mean, we'll have folks like Moses who will talk to God. But when Moses talks to God, the people are so afraid to be in the presence of God that Moses goes in by himself and they stay, and they say, we can't look upon God, we can't hear God's voice. And so God meets certain people, and you sort of get the sense that it's not like it was back in the creation story when God's walking around in the garden talking to Adam and Eve. But it's also an interesting part of the story, because what's happening is the children of Israel are now responsible for the message. Before, God was delivering the message directly, but now it's their message to deliver. It's the same promise, the same message, but it's now the responsibility of the people to share the message. But that's an interesting decision that God's making, because we've read Genesis and we know how the people are. Right? They've let God down quite a bit from the very beginning. And yet once again God puts trust in these people to share the stories, to carry on the legacy, to remember Yahweh. It's up to these people who have proven that they mess up things all the time. It's a bad track record, and yet God places trust in these people. And it's a story that I think, just like the first audience, we can relate to. We can relate to this story. Because very few of us have seen God face to face, negotiated with God like Abraham. But we're still responsible for carrying the story of the good news of a God who desires to love people and love the world. That's just like Israel and just like Israel's sons. We're the ones who God has placed trust in. And we can look at it and say, well, that's a crazy idea. But it is exactly what God has always intended. So now we're the latest. We're the latest generation, dating back from Genesis. The latest generation to proclaim the words, to share God's story with the world. But the turning point, I think, begins in this Joseph story. Next week, we are going to finish our study of Genesis. And so next week we're going to be talking about Genesis chapters 46 through 50. The end of the book. Done pretty well. 50 chapters. It's not bad. And on the following Wednesday, November 16th, there's going to be a man named Joe. He's a Jewish, and he's going to come and he's going to share with us a hands-on tutorial of the foods of Passover as we get ready for the book of Exodus, in which the Passover is instituted. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. If you have folks who might be interested in learning a little bit more about Passover from someone who celebrates it every year, that would be a great time. That's going to be on. So next week we'll finish Genesis. It's going to be the following week, November 16th. So I hope that's going to be hard for folks who are on Facebook, but it'll be, they'll have a hard time tasting the food. I guess you could buy some, have it at your house, but otherwise we'll do that, and then we'll begin Exodus on November 30th. And with that, thank you very much. Go Tribe. What's that? Go Kings.